At my son's seventh-day memorial, I saw my daughter-in-law smile into her phone and write the words, "the new heiress." And in that quiet room filled with flowers and whispered condolences, something inside me went perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not reach for her arm. I simply stood there, holding the folded memorial card between my fingers, and watched the glow of her screen reflect in her eyes as if grief were nothing more than a backdrop. The room smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that clings to solemn days. And I had chosen my black dress carefully that morning. The one Daniel said made me look strong, not sad. I remember smoothing the fabric over my hands before leaving the house, telling myself that I would get through the service with dignity, that I would honor my son the way he deserved. Daniel had always valued quiet strength. He hated scenes. He believed in showing up, doing what was right, and leaving the rest unsaid. That belief was the only thing holding me upright as I stood a few feet away from Vanessa, watching her tilt her head slightly to find her best angle. Around us, people spoke in low voices, offering sympathy that felt both kind and distant. A neighbor touched my elbow. Someone mentioned how sudden it all was. I nodded when appropriate. I said thank you when I was supposed to. But my attention kept returning to that small, bright rectangle in Vanessa's hand. She tapped the screen once, twice, and then lowered it with a satisfied little breath, as if she had just completed something important. I didn't need to see the post again. The words had already carved themselves into me. The new heiress. Not widow. Not grieving wife. Not even Daniel's partner. Heiress. As if this day, this room, this gathering of people who loved my son, was simply a threshold she had been waiting to cross. I felt the weight of 38 years of motherhood settle quietly on my shoulders. I thought about the nights Daniel had a fever as a child, the mornings I packed his lunches, the way he used to call me after big meetings just to say, "Mom, I think I did okay." I thought about the last conversation we had, only a week before everything changed, when he stood in my kitchen and told me not to worry about anything, that he had everything handled. At the time, I assumed he meant work, or bills, or the usual things people say when they don't want their mothers to stress. Now, standing in that room, I wondered what he had really meant. Vanessa slipped her phone into her purse and turned toward a small group of guests, her expression shifting effortlessly into something softer, something appropriately solemn. She reached for a hand, nodded at a kind word, even lowered her gaze at just the right moment. If I hadn't seen what I had seen, I might have believed it. That was the unsettling part. Not just the words she chose, but how easily she moved between roles, how naturally she stepped into a version of herself that the room expected. I felt a strange clarity begin to form, not loud or dramatic, but steady and precise. Grief was still there, of course, sitting heavy in my chest, but alongside it came something else. Awareness. I realized that whatever this was, it had not begun today. A single post doesn't come from nowhere. A caption like that doesn't appear without a story behind it. I looked around the room again, at the framed photograph of Daniel near the front, at the candles flickering softly beneath it, at the people who had come to remember him. And then I looked back at Vanessa. She was laughing now, just a little, her hand briefly touching someone's arm in a gesture that looked almost rehearsed. I lowered my eyes to the memorial card in my hand and folded it once more, carefully, aligning the edges. I didn't need to confront her. Not here. Not now. This room belonged to Daniel. This day belonged to him. But as I stood there, breathing in the quiet, measured rhythm I had practiced all morning, I understood something with absolute certainty. Whatever Vanessa believed she had become, whatever she thought she had claimed, she had said it too soon, and she had said it out loud. And that, I knew, was a mistake. I stayed until the last guest left because that is what Daniel would have done, even though every minute felt like standing in a room where the air had been quietly replaced with something thinner. People moved slowly, their voices soft, their footsteps careful on the polished floor as if grief could be disturbed by too much noise. I thanked each person who came, shook hands, accepted embraces that lingered just a second too long, and listened to stories about my son that I had heard before and some I had not. A colleague spoke about Daniel's patience during a difficult project. A neighbor remembered how he helped shovel snow from her driveway during a harsh winter. Each memory was like a small light, steady and warm, and I held on to them because they felt real, because they belonged to him, not to whatever quiet shift had begun around me. Vanessa remained nearby, never far enough to be absent, never close enough to be comforting. She positioned herself where people could see her easily, near the photograph, near the guest book, near the center of the room. When someone approached her, she tilted her head slightly, lowered her voice, and accepted their condolences with a practiced softness that did not quite reach her eyes. I noticed the way she glanced toward the front table more than once, where the framed documents and condolence cards had been arranged, as if she were already cataloging what mattered and what did not. At one point, she stepped closer to me and placed her hand lightly on my arm. It was a gesture that would have looked supportive to anyone watching. "You should sit down for a moment," she said quietly. "You have been on your feet for hours." Her tone was gentle, almost concerned, but there was something measured underneath it, something that felt less like care and more like positioning. I looked at her hand, then at her face, and offered a small nod. "I am all right," I replied. And I was, in the sense that I was still standing, still breathing, still able to move through the room without breaking. That would have to be enough for now. As the crowd began to thin, the room changed. The low hum of conversation faded, replaced by the soft rustle of coats and the quiet closing of doors. The staff moved in with polite efficiency, collecting empty cups, straightening chairs, clearing away the remnants of a gathering that had tried its best to be dignified. I watched as one of them adjusted the flowers near Daniel's photograph, turning a slightly wilted stem so that it faced away from view. It was such a small act, but it struck me deeply, the instinct to preserve appearances even in something as simple as a bouquet. When the last guest finally stepped out into the late afternoon light, I found myself alone in the room for the first time since the service began, except for Vanessa, who stood a few feet away scrolling through her phone again. The silence settled differently now. It was no longer shared. It was personal. I walked slowly toward the table where Daniel's photograph rested and placed my hand beside the frame, not touching it, just close enough to feel the presence of it. "You would not have liked this," I thought, not as a complaint, but as a quiet acknowledgement. He had always believed that certain moments deserved respect without explanation. He would have noticed the difference immediately. Behind me, I heard the soft click of Vanessa's heels as she approached. "We should start thinking about the next steps," she said, her voice returning to that composed, practical tone. "There are a lot of things that need to be organized." I did not turn right away. I let her words settle, felt their weight, measured their timing. Not tomorrow. Not next week. Now. I turned then, meeting her gaze fully for the first time since I saw the message on her phone. "There will be time for that," I said evenly. "Today is not that time." She held my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as if deciding how much to push, then offered a small, tight smile. "Of course," she replied. But the words sounded like a placeholder, not an agreement. As we walked out together, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, stretching everything into something slightly unfamiliar. I paused by my car and looked back at the building, at the doors that had just closed behind us, and felt the finality of it settle quietly into place. The service was over. The part where everything looked as it should had ended. What remained, I understood now, would not be guided by tradition or expectation. It would be shaped by choices, by what people revealed when they thought no one was really paying attention. I reached into my purse and took out my keys, the metal cool against my palm, grounding me in something simple and certain. Across the lot, Vanessa was already walking toward her own car, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world. I watched her for a moment, not with anger, not even with disbelief, but with a clarity that felt almost unfamiliar. Then I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and closed it gently behind me, carrying that clarity with me into whatever came next. The house felt unfamiliar when I stepped inside, not because anything had changed, but because something had shifted in the way I was seeing it. The hallway was exactly as I had left it that morning, the same framed photographs lining the wall, the same soft light filtering through the curtains, but the silence carried a different weight now, one that did not belong to grief alone. I set my keys down in the small dish by the door and paused for a moment, listening, as if I might hear Daniel's voice from another room, calling out something ordinary like he used to. Nothing came. I moved through the house slowly, almost carefully, as if I were stepping into a place that required permission. In the kitchen, A mug still sat in the drying rack from the night before, the faint outline of a coffee stain along the rim. I picked it up, rinsed it without thinking, and placed it back with the others. The motion was automatic, but it steadied me, gave my hands something to do while my mind began to replay the day in quiet, deliberate fragments. The way Vanessa held her phone, the exact phrasing of those words, the ease with which she stepped into a role that had not been offered, only assumed. I pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down, folding my hands in front of me the same way I had done countless times before, except now there was no conversation waiting to begin, no shared meal, no simple exchange to fill the space. Just silence, and the slow, unfolding realization that what I had seen was not an accident. I closed my eyes briefly and tried to place it within the context of everything that had come before, and that was when the smaller moments began to return to me, the ones I had dismissed at the time because they did not seem important enough to question. A conversation Vanessa had once redirected when I asked Daniel about his long-term plans. A document she had offered to organize to make things easier, her tone light, but her eyes attentive. The way she had gradually taken over decisions that used to be discussed openly, presenting them as already settled by the time I heard about them. None of it had felt overt. None of it had been sharp enough to challenge directly. But now, sitting there in the quiet of my kitchen, the pattern became clearer, each memory fitting into place with a precision that felt almost deliberate. I stood up and walked toward Daniel's study, a room I had not entered since the day everything changed. The door was slightly ajar, just as he had left it, and I pushed it open gently, the faint scent of his cologne still lingering in the air. His desk was neat, almost too neat, as if he had cleared it intentionally, leaving only what mattered within reach. A notebook lay closed beside his laptop, and I ran my fingers lightly over the cover without opening it. Not yet, not until I understood what I was looking for. I moved to the bookshelf, scanning the familiar titles, the arrangement unchanged, and then my gaze settled on a small file box tucked neatly on the lower shelf. It was nothing remarkable, the kind of box you might overlook entirely, but something about its placement caught my attention, deliberate but unobtrusive. I crouched down and lifted the lid, revealing a series of folders organized with Daniel's usual precision, each labeled in his careful handwriting. Financial records, insurance documents, property details. I did not rush. I turned each folder slowly, taking in the structure, the order, the intention behind it. Daniel had always believed that clarity was a form of protection. If everything is in its place, he used to say, no one can move it without being noticed. The words echoed in my mind as I closed the box and set it back exactly where I had found it. I did not need to read everything today. I only needed to know that there was something here, something he had prepared, something that might explain the confidence I had seen in Vanessa's eyes. I straightened up and took a slow breath, feeling that same steady clarity settle over me. Again, stronger this time, less uncertain. This was not about confronting her in anger or proving a point in the moment. It was about understanding what Daniel had already put in place and why. I turned off the light in the study and closed the door behind me, leaving the room exactly as it had been, untouched, preserved. As I walked back into the hallway, the house no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt watchful, as if it were waiting, holding its own quiet knowledge within its walls. I picked up my phone from the kitchen counter and held it in my hand for a moment, considering who to call, not out of impulse, but with intention. There was one person who would know where to begin, one person Daniel trusted with the details he did not share lightly. I did not dial immediately. Instead, I set the phone back down and looked out the window at the fading light of the day, letting the decision settle fully into place. Tomorrow would be soon enough. For now, it was enough to understand that what I had seen was not the beginning of something new. It was the surface of something that had been building quietly, patiently, long before today, and whatever came next, I would meet it with the same calm Daniel had always believed in, steady, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a quiet stretch of pale light slipping through the curtains and settling across the kitchen floor as if nothing had changed at all. I stood by the sink with a cup of coffee in my hands, watching the steam rise in thin, steady lines, and let the stillness settle around me before I moved. There was a time when mornings like this would begin with a call from Daniel, brief and familiar, asking if I had remembered to take my vitamins or telling me about some small detail from the day before that he thought I would find amusing. Those calls had never felt important in the moment, but now, in their absence, they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. I set the cup down carefully and reached for my phone, the decision I had delayed the night before already clear in my mind. The number was still there, unchanged, just as it had been for years, and I pressed it without hesitation. It rang twice before a calm, measured voice answered. Martin Hale speaking. I closed my eyes for a brief second, grounding myself in the familiarity of it. Martin, it is Evelyn Carter, I said. There was a pause, not of confusion, but of recognition, and then his tone softened slightly. Mrs. Carter, I was expecting to hear from you sooner or later. I am very sorry for your loss. The words were sincere, but there was something else beneath them, something that suggested he already understood more than I had said. Thank you, I replied quietly. I would like to come by and speak with you, if you are available. Of course, he said without hesitation. I will make time. Would late morning work for you? I glanced at the clock on the wall, noting the slow, deliberate movement of the second hand. Yes, I said. That would be fine. After we ended the call, I remained standing there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, as if the simple act of reaching out had shifted something into motion that could not be undone. I did not feel anxious. I did not feel rushed. What I felt was a quiet alignment, as though I had stepped into a path that had been waiting for me to notice it. I finished my coffee, rinsed the cup, and set it in the rack with the same careful precision I had used the day before. Then I moved through the house with purpose, not hurried, but intentional, selecting a coat, gathering my keys, checking once more that everything was in its place. Before I left, I paused outside Daniel's study, my hand resting lightly on the doorframe. I did not open it this time. I did not need to. Whatever answers were inside that room would still be there when I returned. The drive to Martin's office was familiar, a route I had taken many times before under very different circumstances, and I noticed how ordinary everything looked. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Cars moved in steady lines. A man walked his dog along the sidewalk, completely unaware of how easily a life could shift from one moment to the next. I parked in the same spot I had used years ago and sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the building with a clarity that felt almost detached. This was not a place of conflict. It was a place of record, of structure, of truth written down and preserved. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the receptionist offering a polite smile as she recognized me. Mrs. Carter, Mr. Hale is expecting you, she said, gesturing toward the hallway. I nodded and followed, my footsteps steady against the carpet, until I reached the door that had been opened for me more than once in the past. Martin stood as I entered, his expression composed, his manner respectful without being overly familiar. Please, have a seat, he said, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. I sat, placing my hands in my lap, and met his gaze directly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he leaned forward slightly, his voice measured, careful. I imagine there are some things you would like to understand, he said. I considered his words, the way he chose them, and nodded once. Yes, I replied. There are. I did not mention Vanessa. I did not mention the photograph or the caption or the way she had carried herself the day before. I did not need to. Martin watched me for a moment longer, then reached for a folder on his desk, one that had clearly been set aside in advance. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he rested his hand on top of it, as if acknowledging its significance before revealing its contents. Daniel came to see me several months ago, he said slowly. He wanted to make some adjustments, not because anything was wrong, but because he believed in being prepared. The words settled between us, calm and deliberate, and I felt that same quiet clarity return, stronger now, anchored by something tangible. Prepared. It was a word Daniel had always taken seriously, and as Martin finally opened the folder, I understood that whatever I had begun to see was only a small part of something much larger, something my son had already anticipated long before any of this came to light. Martin did not rush as he opened the folder, and I appreciated that, the way he allowed the moment to unfold at its own pace instead of turning it into something abrupt or overwhelming. Inside were documents arranged with the same careful order I had seen in Daniel's study, each page aligned, each section clearly marked, as if my son had anticipated that one day I would be sitting here, needing to understand everything without confusion. Daniel was very specific, Martin said, his voice steady, almost gentle. He did not want anything left open to interpretation. I nodded slightly, my eyes moving over the first page, recognizing Daniel's signature immediately, the familiar slant of his handwriting anchoring me in something real. He created a trust, Martin continued, turning a page with deliberate care. Most of his assets are not held in his name directly. They are protected, structured in a way that limits control to designated conditions. The words were precise, legal, but their meaning was clear enough. Protected, limited, structured. This was not the work of someone who assumed everything would remain simple. This was the work of someone who had considered the possibility that it would not. And those conditions? I asked quietly, lifting my gaze to meet his. Martin paused, just briefly, as if weighing how to present what came next. They are tied to conduct, he said. Daniel included provisions that address behavior following his passing, particularly in situations involving public representation of the family and the handling of his legacy. I felt something settle into place inside me, not surprise, but confirmation, as if a thought I had not fully formed was now being spoken aloud. He was concerned, Martin added, choosing his words carefully, that certain actions might reflect poorly on what he built, or on the values he believed in. I lowered my eyes back to the document, reading more closely now, taking in the language, the structure, the quiet firmness of it. There were clauses outlining distribution, timelines, responsibilities, but woven through them was something else, something less tangible, but no less intentional. Expectations, standards, boundaries that did not rely on emotion, only on what could be observed and proven. There is also a primary beneficiary, Martin said, turning another page and sliding it slightly closer to me. Chloe Carter. The name did not surprise me, but seeing it there, formalized, written into something permanent, carried a weight that felt both steady and reassuring. Daniel wanted to ensure her future was secure, Martin continued. He also appointed her as a central figure in how certain decisions are made, though not without oversight. I traced the line of text with my eyes, absorbing the details. The clarity of Daniel's intentions, and then I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting it all settle. Vanessa's voice from the day before echoed faintly in my memory, the confidence, the certainty, the way she had spoken as if everything had already been decided. I did not feel anger. I felt distance, a growing separation between what she believed and what was actually true. Does she know? I asked, my voice even. Martin shook his head once. Not in full, he said. She was aware that there were arrangements, but the specifics were not disclosed. Daniel was very deliberate about that. Of course he was, I thought, a quiet recognition passing through me. He had not been careless. He had not been naive. He had simply chosen not to create conflict before it was necessary. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly in my lap, and looked at Martin with a calm that felt more solid than anything I had felt in days. And the provisions tied to conduct, I said. How are they evaluated? Martin met my gaze without hesitation. Through documentation, he replied. Through evidence that demonstrates whether those conditions have been met or violated. Evidence. The word lingered, precise and unmistakable. I thought of the phone in Vanessa's hand, the image she had captured, the words she had chosen so casually, so publicly. I thought of the way she had carried herself in that room, the subtle shifts in tone, the positioning, the quiet assumption of authority. None of it had been hidden. None of it had been private. I exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in understanding. Daniel trusted you, I said, not as a question, but as a statement. Martin inclined his head slightly. He did, he replied, and he trusted that you would know what to do when the time came. The room fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, one that did not press in or weigh down, but instead held space for thought, for clarity, for the next step to take shape without urgency. I looked down at the documents one more time, then back at Martin, and gave a small, decisive nod. I understand, I said, and for the first time since I had seen those words on Vanessa's screen, I truly did. When I stepped out of Martin's office, the air felt different. Not lighter, but clearer, as if something that had been clouded was now defined by clean, unmistakable lines. I did not rush to my car. I walked at a steady pace, aware of each step, of the quiet rhythm of my heels against the pavement, of the way the late morning sun reflected off the windows around me. People passed by without noticing me, carrying coffee cups, checking their phones, moving through their day with the ease of ordinary routines. And for the first time since everything had happened, I felt as though I was no longer standing outside of that flow. I reached my car and paused before opening the door, placing my hand briefly against the cool surface, grounding myself in something solid. The documents Martin had shown me were not just legal protections. They were a message, one Daniel had written in the only language that could not be ignored or twisted. He had seen something. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to prepare for it. Enough to ensure that what mattered would not be easily taken or misrepresented. I sat down behind the wheel and closed the door gently, letting the quiet of the enclosed space settle around me. For a moment, I did nothing. I did not start the engine. I did not reach for my phone. I simply sat there, allowing the realization to take its full shape without interruption. Vanessa had believed she was stepping into something that had already been secured for her. She had believed that her role, her position, her proximity to Daniel was enough to define what came next. But Daniel had not left anything to assumption. He had not trusted circumstances to remain stable. He had built something that required more than appearance, more than timing, more than quiet confidence. I started the car and pulled out slowly, merging into traffic with the same deliberate care I had applied to everything else that morning. The drive home felt shorter, not because the distance had changed, but because my mind was no longer circling the same questions. It was moving forward now, piece by piece, aligning what I had seen with what I now understood. When I arrived, the house greeted me with the same stillness as before, but it no longer felt uncertain. It felt like a place where things could be put in order, where clarity could exist. Without interruption, I set my keys down and removed my coat, placing it neatly on the hook by the door, then moved into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip as I considered the next step. There was no urgency. That was the difference. I did not need to confront Vanessa immediately, did not need to correct her assumptions in a burst of emotion. The truth did not require volume. It required timing. I carried the glass with me into the living room and sat down, letting my eyes move over the familiar details of the space, the photographs, the furniture, the quiet evidence of a life that had been built over years, not claimed in a moment. My phone rested on the table beside me, and after a moment, I picked it up, scrolling briefly before stopping on a name I had not called in some time. Chloe. I did not press it yet. Instead, I looked at it, considering what Martin had said, the role Daniel had assigned, the responsibility that came with it. Chloe had always been perceptive, more so than most people realized. She had seen things others overlooked, understood shifts before they were fully visible. If anyone else had noticed what I had begun to piece together, it would be her. I set the phone back down and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for just a moment, allowing a single, steady breath to settle everything into place. This was not about exposing Vanessa in anger or proving her wrong in a way that would create a scene. It was about allowing the structure Daniel had created to reveal itself at the right time, in the right way, without distortion. I opened my eyes again and reached for the phone once more, this time without hesitation, pressing Chloe's name and lifting it to my ear as it began to ring. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its sound fading into the distance, and I listened to the steady tone on the line, calm, measured, patient. When she answered, her voice was soft, careful, as if she already understood that this call was not casual. "Grandma," she said. I held the phone a little closer, my voice steady, grounded in everything I now knew. "Chloe," I replied, "we need to talk." Chloe did not ask unnecessary questions on the phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how much she already understood. There was a pause after I spoke, not long, but deliberate, as if she were choosing her words with care. "I can come over," she said finally, her voice steady but quieter than usual. I glanced at the clock, noting the time, the way the afternoon light had begun to soften. "That would be good," I replied. "Take your time." When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and stood up, moving through the house with a sense of quiet preparation. I did not rearrange anything or attempt to create a setting for the conversation. There was no need. The truth did not require decoration. It required space. I opened a window slightly, letting in a thin stream of cool air, and then returned to the kitchen, setting out 2 glasses of water on the table without thinking, a small gesture of normalcy that felt grounding in its simplicity. By the time I heard Chloe's car pull into the driveway, the house was still, settled, waiting. I walked to the door and opened it before she had the chance to knock. She stood there for a moment, her expression composed, but her eyes searching, taking in my face as if measuring something she could not quite name. "Hi, Grandma," she said softly. "Come in," I replied, stepping aside. She moved past me into the house, her footsteps quiet, her posture more reserved than usual, as though she already sensed that this was not a visit that would pass lightly. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where Daniel had once sat between us, turning ordinary evenings into something warm and unremarkable in the best possible way. Chloe rested her hands around the glass I had set out for her, but did not drink. Instead, she looked at me directly, her gaze steady, waiting. I did not begin with explanations. I did not need to. "You saw it," I said, my voice calm. It was not a question. Chloe nodded once, her lips pressing together briefly. "Yes," she said. "I saw it before it was taken down." I held her gaze for a moment longer, noting the absence of surprise, the quiet certainty in her tone. "And?" I asked, not because I did not know, but because I wanted to hear how she understood it. Chloe exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around the glass. "It was not just careless," she said. "It was intentional." The words settled between us, simple and exact. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging it. "That is what I thought," I replied. There was another pause, one that felt less uncertain now, more aligned, as if we were both standing on the same ground. Chloe glanced briefly toward the hallway, then back at me. "She has been acting differently for a while," she continued. "Small things at first, talking about decisions like they were already made, asking questions that did not really sound like questions." I listened without interrupting, letting her piece together what she had observed. "After," she hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. "After everything happened, it became more obvious." She started referring to things as hers. Not directly, but enough that it stood out. I leaned back slightly in my chair, absorbing her words, feeling the pattern solidify further. "You did not say anything," I noted. Chloe shook her head. "I was not sure yet," she said. I did not want to accuse her of something without being certain. "But after yesterday," she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The meaning was already clear. I reached for my glass and took a small sip of water, setting it back down with deliberate care before speaking again. "I went to see Martin this morning," I said. Chloe's eyes sharpened slightly at the name, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed. "And?" she asked. I met her gaze fully, allowing the calm I had carried since leaving his office to settle into my voice. "Your father was prepared," I said. The words seemed to land with a quiet weight, and Chloe straightened slightly, her attention fully focused now. "Prepared how?" she asked. I did not rush to answer. Instead, I let a small silence pass, not to create tension, but to give the moment its proper shape. "In ways that cannot be undone by assumption," I said finally. "In ways that require more than proximity or appearance." Chloe studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly, as if something she had suspected was now confirmed. "So she does not actually have what she thinks she has," she said. It was not a question. I allowed the faintest trace of a smile to touch my expression, not out of satisfaction, but out of recognition. "No," I replied quietly. "She does not." The room fell silent again, but it was no longer uncertain or heavy. It was steady, anchored by understanding, by the alignment of what we had seen and what we now knew. Chloe glanced down at her hands, then back up at me, her expression more resolved than before. "What do we do?" she asked. I folded my hands together on the table, my voice calm, measured, unwavering. "We do not rush," I said. "We let her continue to believe what she believes." Chloe held my gaze, searching for hesitation, for doubt, but finding none. "And when the time comes?" she asked. I met her eyes without looking away. "Then we let the truth speak for itself," I said. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that looked ordinary from the outside, but underneath it, everything had shifted into quiet alignment. Vanessa moved through the house with a new kind of confidence, subtle but unmistakable, as if she had already stepped into a role no one had formally given her. She began making small changes, not large enough to draw attention, but precise enough to establish presence. A different arrangement of documents on the dining table. A conversation redirected before it reached me. A suggestion framed as a decision. I noticed each one, not with irritation, but with a growing clarity that made every detail sharper, more defined. Chloe came by more often, though she never stayed long. Her visits measured, intentional, her eyes always observant. We did not repeat the conversation we had already had. There was no need. Instead, we moved through the same space with a shared understanding, one that did not require explanation. One afternoon, Vanessa stood in the living room with her phone in hand, speaking in a tone that was meant to sound composed, but carried a trace of something else beneath it, something that leaned just slightly toward assumption. "I have been reviewing some of the accounts," she said, glancing up briefly as I entered the room. "There are a few things that will need to be reorganized moving forward." I paused near the doorway, not interrupting, not questioning, simply allowing her words to settle in the space between us. "That sounds like a detailed process," I replied evenly. She nodded, her expression confident. "It is," she said, "but it is necessary." There was a moment, brief but telling, where she seemed to expect more from me, perhaps a question, perhaps a challenge, something that would acknowledge her position. When it did not come, she continued speaking, filling the silence with explanations that were not being requested. I listened without reacting, letting her outline plans that were not yet hers to make, noting the way she framed each statement as though it had already been agreed upon. Later that evening, after she had retreated to her room, I sat alone in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp casting long shadows across the floor, and allowed myself to reflect on the precision of what Daniel had done. He had not created conflict. He had created structure. He had not removed possibility. He had defined its boundaries. And now, those boundaries were beginning to reveal themselves, not through confrontation, but through contrast, through the quiet difference between what was assumed and what was actually true. The following day, a message arrived from Martin, confirming that the necessary arrangements were in place for a formal review of Daniel's estate, a meeting that would bring everything into clear view, not as speculation, but as fact. I read the message once, then again, noting the date, the time, the language used. It was neutral, professional, exact. There was no room for interpretation, no space for assumption. I set the phone down and looked out the window, watching as the late afternoon light shifted across the street, the world outside continuing its steady, indifferent pace. Inside, however, everything was moving toward a moment that would not be easily undone. That evening, Vanessa mentioned the meeting in passing, her tone casual, as if it were a formality rather than a turning point. "We should all be there," she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "It will be important to finalize everything." I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging the statement without adding to it. "Yes," I said, "it will be important." Chloe arrived shortly after, her presence calm, her expression composed, and the three of us sat in the same room, the air between us carrying a stillness that was no longer uncertain, but deliberate. Vanessa spoke occasionally, outlining expectations, referencing future plans, her confidence unshaken, her belief intact. Chloe listened, quietly, her gaze steady, her silence more revealing than any response. I sat between them, not as a mediator, not as an observer, but as someone who understood exactly where each of them stood and exactly what was coming next. As the evening drew to a close, Vanessa gathered her things with the same composed efficiency she had shown all day, her movements precise, her posture assured. "Tomorrow will clarify everything," she said lightly, as if she were confirming something already decided. I met her gaze, my expression calm, unchanged. "Yes," I replied softly, "it will." And as she turned away, stepping out of the room with the same quiet confidence she had carried since the memorial, I remained where I was, still, composed, and certain of one thing above all else. When clarity arrives, it does not need to announce itself. It simply stands, undeniable, in the light. The meeting room was quieter than I expected, not empty, but contained, as if even the air understood that something precise was about to unfold. Martin sat at the head of the table, a folder placed neatly in front of him, his posture composed, his expression neutral in the way that only comes from years of handling moments like this without allowing emotion to interfere. Chloe sat to my right, her hands folded calmly in her lap, her gaze steady, and across from us. Vanessa leaned slightly forward in her chair, her confidence intact, her attention fixed on the documents as though she were already anticipating their confirmation. I took my seat without hesitation, placing my hands lightly on the table, not gripping, not bracing, simply present. There was no need to speak first. Martin began without ceremony, his voice measured, each word clear and deliberate as he outlined the structure Daniel had created, the trust, the conditions, the framework that governed everything now. Vanessa listened closely at first, nodding occasionally, her expression composed, but as he moved further into the details, something began to shift, subtle at first, a slight tightening around her eyes, a pause where there should have been certainty. As specified, Martin continued, turning a page with careful precision. The primary beneficiary of the trust is Chloe Carter, with oversight provisions that ensure all decisions align with the conditions established by Daniel. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, not loud, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Vanessa's posture changed almost imperceptibly, her shoulders drawing back, her gaze sharpening as she processed what had just been said. "I believe there must be some misunderstanding," she said, her tone still controlled, but carrying the first trace of tension. Martin did not react to the tone, only to the words. "There is no misunderstanding," he replied evenly. "The documentation is explicit." He turned another page, sliding a document slightly forward, allowing the language to speak for itself. Vanessa glanced down, her eyes moving quickly over the text, then back up again, her composure holding, but no longer as effortless as it had been. "And what about everything else?" she asked, her voice tightening just slightly. "The accounts, the property, the decisions that need to be made?" Martin inclined his head slightly. "All of those fall under the same structure," he said. "Access and authority are conditional, not assumed." There was a pause then, longer this time, and in that space, the difference between belief and reality became visible, not through argument, but through the absence of confirmation Vanessa had expected to receive. I did not interrupt. I did not need to. Chloe remained still beside me, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, grounded in something that did not require defense. Vanessa looked from Martin to me, then to Chloe, as if searching for something she could still claim, some angle that had not yet been addressed. "This is not what Daniel told me," she said finally, her voice quieter now, more controlled, but lacking the certainty it had carried before. I met her gaze without hesitation, my expression calm, my voice steady. "Daniel believed in preparation," I said. That was all. No accusation, no elaboration, just a statement that carried the weight of everything he had put in place. Martin closed the folder gently, not with finality, but with completion, as if the explanation had reached its natural end. "If there are further questions," he said, "they can be addressed through the appropriate channels. For now, everything is clearly defined." Vanessa did not respond immediately. She looked down at the documents again, then away, her thoughts moving quickly, recalculating, adjusting to a reality that no longer aligned with what she had assumed. The room remained quiet, not tense, but resolved, the kind of quiet that follows clarity rather than confusion. After a moment, Vanessa gathered her things with careful precision, her movements controlled, her posture still composed, but altered in a way that did not need to be named. She did not look at me as she stood. She did not need to. What had been spoken required no further acknowledgement. Chloe rose beside me, her presence steady, her expression thoughtful, and together we stepped away from the table, leaving the documents where they were, complete, unchanged, undeniable. As we walked out into the afternoon light, the world outside looked exactly as it had the day before, cars passing, people moving, everything continuing without pause, and yet something fundamental had shifted, not in the world, but in the alignment of truth and perception. I paused briefly at the edge of the sidewalk, the sunlight warm against my face, and allowed myself a single, quiet breath, not of relief, but of recognition. There are moments when nothing needs to be taken back, nothing needs to be forced, nothing needs to be said again. The truth stands on its own, clear and unshaken, and those who built their certainty on assumption are left with nothing to hold on to. I turned then, walking forward with the same steady pace I had carried from the beginning, leaving behind not conflict, but clarity, and with it, the quiet certainty that Daniel had not been overlooked, not in life, and not in what he chose to leave behind.